Okay, guys. Here we are. Final chapter of how the Irish saved civilization. And the end of the world. Is there any hope? It's titled. Page 199. At Pentecost of 597, which is a Christian celebration that celebrates after Jesus had gone back to heaven when the Holy Spirit came down to people. Just before the mighty Columcille breathed his last in his island monastery of Iona, just before Columcille died, an English king was baptized in his capital of Canterbury by a timid Roman librarian whom Gregory the Great had sent to evangelize the English. Though Patrick had brought the gospel to the Irish more than a century and a half earlier, and Columcille had departed to the Scots 40 years previously, this is the first instance of a papal mission to the pagans. So he's just talking about the irony that 150 years ago, Patrick had taken the gospel to the Irish. 40 years before, Columcille had taken it to the Scottish, and finally the Pope decides he cares about taking the gospel to other cultures, and so he sends one person over to England, right? And so just the irony of how much more earnest Patrick and his Irish monks were about this work than the Catholic Church was. At least that's how Cahill is presenting the history here. Page 200, first full paragraph. The Irish Celts who had not suffered at Anglo-Saxons' hands had no such inhibitions. So you say one reason for this is the Europeans were afraid of the Celts. The Celts being the Scottish and the Irish and the English. Together, the ancient Scottish, Irish, English, that part of the world, they were called the Celts. And they've been coming over, raping, pillaging, kidnapping. That's what happened to Patrick. He was kidnapped, right? And so part of the reason that the mainland Europeans didn't reach out to these people sooner was because they were afraid of them. The Irish weren't afraid. The Irish knew where these people were coming from. They knew what it was like to be, rough and mean and nasty, and their culture had been transformed, so they were not afraid of getting their hands dirty by going to the Celtic people in England, in Scotland, and in England, reaching out to them. Page 200, second full paragraph. But the stricter Roman Christianity of Augustine's Canterbury was also slowly spreading north and went through the English territories and was bound eventually to meet Celtic Christianity. So even though it's very slow, the mainland European Catholic Christianity is moving towards Ireland as Ireland's moving towards it, and eventually they're going to clash. A clash of custom and sensibility was as unavoidable as it had been between Columbanus and the Burgundian bishops. It came to a head at a synod, a conference, a religious conference, held in 664, at which a king ruled in favor of the Roman party. Meaning you had the Roman party and the Irish party, and the king ruled in favor of the Roman party. The main issue, the Roman Catholic party, the main issue was what was the correct date to celebrate Easter. And so they were arguing about what the correct day for celebrating Easter is, as if anybody knew what day Easter actually happened. Page 201, go down about 6 lines. The early Christian fathers could not have been bothered with anything as mundane as calendar calculations. It is a mark of how simple-minded and inflexible the thought of the age had become that the issue of a calendar could have come so close to precipitating schism. Next paragraph. As it happened, the Irish party gave in. So they were arguing about what date was the correct date. The Irish party gave in with a few holdouts who came over in time. They agreed, however, reluctantly, that their father in God, Columbkill, whose name was invoked in all their customs, took second place to Peter, the prince of the Lord's apostles, in whose name the Roman party made its arguments. Hold on one moment. Be right back. The solution was a simple one. Our relics, the bones of our founder, are holier than your bones. So Rome is greater than Iona. Remember, Iona was Columbkill's monastery that he created in Scotland. And thus, we've got right on our side. So basically, we've got Peter's bones, and those are greater than Columbkill's bones. And so, in other words, you guys have to go with the date that we set for Easter. And as Cahill makes the argument, he's like, in an earlier time, it would have been much more serious questions they were talking about than just the date to celebrate a holiday. So he's like, it's really kind of silly what they were arguing about here. But really, it was about who was going to have authority in making decisions about Christian faith and belief and practice. Was it going to be the Irish or the or the mainland European Catholic Church? Bottom of 201. This moment, this debate about the date of Easter and what happened as a result has been used repeatedly by both Anglicans, Church of England people, and Roman Catholics to defend their positions against each other. And it's almost impossible to read any historian of this period without getting a whiff of partisanship. For Anglicans, or Church of England people, the clash proves that there was an indigenous British church that preceded Roman interference. For Catholics, the Celtic acquiescence shows that the Celtic Christians acknowledged that Rome would set the norm. Rome would set the policies and the rules for the Christian faith. And so even today, you have this continued perspective on this meeting when they argued about the date of Easter. And the people in the Church of England argue, even, when Catholicism came over here, we already had our version of Christianity, which is why you had this debate. And the Roman Catholic Church says, yes, and see, when we had the debate, your side agreed that we would set the standards, if all that makes sense. So it's even an ongoing discussion today, debate. Has been throughout history. It's not debated much today, but it still comes up occasionally, all these years later. Page 202, middle paragraph. The trivial nature of this clash may be seen especially in the other item on Whitby's agenda, the Irish tonsure, which, unlike the Roman shaved circlet at the crown of the head, was achieved by shaving the front of the head from ear to ear and letting the hair and back grow long. Even to our eyes, the Irish tonsure would have a ludicrous appearance, but to the Romans it was proof of barbarian status. How could people who looked so ridiculous mean to suggest that this absurd tonsure was a sign of consecration? So along with the debate about the date of Easter at this meeting, they were arguing about whose hair looked better, whether the Irish monk's haircut was the haircut that everybody was going to go with, or the Catholic monk's haircut. The Roman Catholic monk's haircut was the haircut everybody was going to go with. And so Cahill is just talking about how absurd the things that they were arguing about at this meeting were. Really, in a sense, it was about something much bigger. Who would, from that point, have more of an influence on how Christianity developed? The laid-back, joking Irish culture, and more inclusive, or the stricter, straight-line mainland European view. 202, bottom of 202, what is far more impressive about the period as a whole and perhaps even about what actually happened to Whitby, is the close fraternal cooperation between the Irish and the English. So, I mean, so Cahill, one beautiful thing he sees about this is that the Irish and the English Christians were together. They were one-minded, one-spirited in this argument with the mainland European church, which, of course, later in history, that is not the case. It's too bad it didn't continue that way, to have that unity, seeing each other as equals between the Irish and the English, that you have in this scene. Okay, page 203. The first full paragraph there is talking about Beowulf, how you have around this time some literature being written and old myths, old pagan stories taken and reworked with a Christian theme and with a Christian understanding, which is what you have in Beowulf. Bottom of 203. The Greek approach to thought was now almost completely lost. Baptism, though it had connected the Irish to a larger world, had hardly made them Athenians or Greek philosophers. And though the Irish and now the Saxons succeeded in transcribing the works of ancient philosophers, they could not really understand them. Nor, for that matter, could the few remaining Romans of the West, like Gregory the Great. The intellectual disciplines of distinction, definition, and dialectic that once had been the glory of men like Augustine were unobtainable by readers of the Dark Ages. And the Dark Ages, I'm sorry, Cahill, but that is a term that's really gone out of style. It's kind of, people who use the Dark Ages are basically snobs who use that term, because we've realized, call it the medieval ages, call it whatever you want, but it's not like nothing happened during the Dark Ages. It's not like they didn't have art, literature, music. So really, I'm surprised Cahill's using that term here. This book is, it is a little bit older. Yeah. But moving down, a man no longer subordinate. Next paragraph. Even the Romans at Whitby presented their point of view in the new way. They did not argue, for genuine intellectual dispute was beyond them. They held up pictures for the mind, one set of bones versus another. Page 205. First full paragraph, 5 lines down, 6 lines down. For a century and a half, from the middle of the 5th century to the end of the 6th, there had been, so far as we can tell, no formal communication. Oh, wait. Okay, so what I was just talking about was this concept that the Middle Ages certainly had a more picturesque understanding of the world. They weren't deep philosophers. They were more like painters, They thought with images. They thought with objects. They didn't argue deep philosophical points. They argued with Peter's bones and Columbkill's bones, which personally appeals to me more. I like paintings more than I do deep philosophical writings, art, pictures, stories. This was the imagination of the Middle Ages. So it had changed since the ancient Greeks. It had changed since Augustine. People weren't thinking like that anymore. They were thinking more like Patrick thought, and like the Irish thought. And there was just love of nature and the images of it and the inspiration of it, right? Over on page 205, 6 lines down from on the first full paragraph. For a century and a half, from the middle of the 5th century to the end of the 6th, there had been, so far as we could tell, no formal communication between Rome and the Christians of Britain, nor had there ever been any between Rome and Ireland. Which is why the Celts were still keeping Easter according to calculations that had been twice superseded at Rome. On these marginal islands, who could know for sure what was in, what was out in Rome, let alone in the other ancient centers of Christianity? It was a great moment for diversity, and the Irish continued to thrive. So it was talking about how really, for like 150 years, Rome had no contact with Ireland and almost none with Britain. And so it's not surprising that the Irish were celebrating Easter on a different day than the Romans were, because it was like they just hadn't communicated, right? And there was, which meant that it allowed Irish Christian and belief and society to develop in fascinating ways, to just thrive and develop in interesting ways on its own for a while, because it wasn't, so to speak, under the thumb of of the Roman Church. Page 206. 206, second full paragraph. The Irish connections of the English monks were not. So now you've got, okay, so changing topics a little bit. You had all these Irish monks who went over to mainland Europe and built, to Scotland, into northern England, and sent students into mainland Europe back. They came to Ireland, got their education, then they went back and were spreading education throughout Ireland. And now you've got English monks who were taught by the Irish monks who are going out into mainland Europe. And so these English monks who have learned from the Irish monks are going out, and they are teaching, they are tutoring. They're like tutors going around to kings and princes and going into communities and teaching people. These English monks. Page 206, second full paragraph. The Irish connections of these English monks were not an accident. Besides having profited substantially from the intellectual atmosphere that the Irish foundations had established in Britain, many of these English monks had studied in Ireland or were assisted by Irish monks. And then bottom paragraph there, 206, with the advent of Charlemagne as king of the Franks, and after his surprise coronation by the Pope on Christmas Day, 800, Holy Roman Emperor, we can begin to speak of France in preference to Gaul. So you've got this famous king of, after he becomes king, basically what we get to know as France, this famous sort of first king of France, who is coronated as like the Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope on Christmas Day, the year 800. And under Charlemagne, you have a cultural flowering that barely outlasts his reign, but his enduring influence lay in the gradual revival of literacy, for he repeatedly urged in supporting the raising of standards in the few poor continental schools that remain. So Charlemagne goes on a mission to raise the standards of the schools that have started to grow up in France. He himself was an illiterate who late in life laboriously learned to decipher some simple text but could never get the hang of writing. Without the previous... And so you got Charlemagne, and he comes to the power, and he's trying to raise the educational level of his people, and all of this inspired by English monks who have come and taught him, who themselves were taught by the Irish monks, right? Page 208, first full paragraph. The most splendid blossom of this continental spring was an Irishman, John Scotus Urgina, born about 810, who crossed to France in his early 30s. So an Irish monk, John Scotus Urgina, born about 810, who crossed to France in his early 30s and took a position at Charlemagne's school. John Scotus, who was probably a layman, is the first philosopher of the Middle Ages, the first truly Christian philosopher since the death of Augustine in 430, the first European philosopher since the execution of Boethius in 524. John Scotus is the first man in 300 years who was able to think. Now, again, that's Cahill. Take it with a grain of salt, right? But the first real philosopher that had come around in 300 years, Cahill claims. He also had a vicious sense of humor, penning this two-liner on the death of the anti-Irish Archbishop of Reims. Here lies Hincmur, a crook. But savage greed aside, he did one truly noble thing. He died. His wine-soaked dinners with the emperor were full of parrying wit. At one point, Emperor Charlemagne is joking with John Scotus as they're having dinner, drinking some wine, and he says, "So, John, tell me, what separates a fool from an Irishman?" And John Scotus says, "Only the table between us," right? And so, and there's a legend that he was actually, Eugenia was eventually actually stabbed to death by his own students with their pens. That John Scotus was, because of his sense of humor that got under some people's skin. Page 209. Go down about 7 lines. Here is a mind, again talking about John Scotus. Here is a mind that could grasp the most rarefied distinctions of the Greek philosophical tradition, and far more important, could elaborate a new system of thought, one that is balanced and internally consistent. In John Scotus' system, nature is a virtual synonym for reality, all of reality, our natural world as well as the reality of God. In Scotus, there is no useful distinction between natural and supernatural. Though the system is both subtle and elaborate, one sees immediately his debt to Patrick's simple worldview. Reality is a continuum. All God's creatures are theophanies, like epiphanies of God, for God speaks in them and through them. And so for John Scotus, philosophy and faith, logic and faith, the supernatural in nature, they don't have to be different things. They come together, which is very much the way Patrick saw things in, with his Irish sensibility, right? Page 210, second little paragraph, 2 lines there. In the age of John Scotus Eugenia, Christian churches did not burn books. Only barbarians did that. And so it's this perspective of the Irish Christian church coming that, we're not afraid of knowledge. We're not afraid of ideas. Let's talk about them. Let's listen to people, hear what they have to say, and discuss it, So we're not afraid of it. Yeah. Page 210, after the break, things start to go downhill for Ireland. Even as John Scotus left Ireland to come to mainland Europe, Ireland was under siege. The Vikings had started coming down to Ireland. They had discovered all of this beautiful artwork and stuff that the Irish had created, and the money that the Irish monasteries had because of all these students coming, many of whom did pay for their education, even though they weren't required to. And so the Vikings, now the Irish are peaceful, in a sense, they've been made peaceful by Christianity, and the Vikings come down, and it's like wolves stealing from sheep, They just violently lay into Ireland, destroying books, ripping off their beautiful covers as booty, as prizes. The constant fear of the monks is well illustrated in this 4-line gloss, bottom of 210. Bitter is the wind this night, one of the Irish monks wrote, which tosses up the ocean's hair so white. Merciless men I need not fear who cross from Lothlin on an ocean clear. So this Irish monk's writing, well, it's an awful storm out tonight, so at least we don't need to be afraid of Vikings tonight because they will be sailing on this awful water, right? So Ireland was prosperous. It was the educational center of Europe. And then the Vikings up north started hearing about it and started coming down and making raids, attacking Ireland, burning the monasteries, stealing all of their fancy artwork and stuff that had been created, destroying all these fancy Irish codexes. This is why only a few of them have survived. Like, for example, the Book of Kells. There used to be thousands of them, but most of them get destroyed by, Viking raids. Page 211, line 3, attacks on magical Lindisfarne, which had become the constant source of the most exquisite. It's talking about how one of the major communities that had been created by the Irish monks basically just gets destroyed over time. The monks are stripped and tortured. Things get burned. That's 211, first full paragraph. 211, last paragraph. One by one, the great monastic cities fell before the implacable Vikings. Precious books and metalware were buried in haste or sent inland to someplace thought to be temporary, at least, more secure. And so the Irish monks, they would realize sooner or later their monasteries are going to be burned, and so they would hide these books and stuff or send them to the mainland to be protected. And that's how we got the Book of Kells, which was saved. But so much of it was just destroyed by the Vikings coming down, similar to the way the barbarians came into Europe and wiped out stuff. The Germanic peoples. Page 212. Even today it talks about, a farmer will be out digging in a field in Ireland and dig up some of this ancient treasure that the Irish had. Although, of course, a lot of it is by now ruined and not good anymore, right? 212, first full paragraph. To Irish eyes, the Vikings had little to recommend them. They did establish Ireland's first genuine cities. And so the Vikings established their own cities in Ireland. Dublin was a city established by the Vikings. Ireland's next, page 213, Ireland's next invasion, the Normans. In the 12th century, they came over from France, and they were actually a lot more peaceable. They just came into Ireland and they invaded, but they kind of just adopted Irish customs and settled down and were friendly. So that was okay. But then, with Queen Elizabeth I and the Calvinists, England hits Ireland like a tidal wave of destruction, right? And they just start persecuting them because they look down on them. The Irish are these bumpkins, and they also they're like, what do you have? Nothing, because the Vikings have been coming in and tearing everything up. And so the English, especially because the English are Protestants. The English are now Protestants, beginning with Henry VIII, and his daughter, Elizabeth, is like, look at those Catholic Irish country bumpkins over there. Ireland is right next to us. It should belong to us, and we should take it over and control it. And so they do. And they make things so bad for the Irish. In the 18th century, they established these kind of things called the penal laws, which are like the Jim Crow laws that we had in America. Only the penal laws were a lot worse. And so it's just crushing the spirit of the Irish. And they get to the point where, they're living off of potatoes because the English basically won't let them have anything else. And then you have the Great Hunger when there's a famine. And from 1845 to 1851, all the potato plants get diseased, and the Irish are just starving left and right. And many of them end up running off to America. That's where you have this massive migration of desperately poor Irish people to America because they know if they stay in Ireland, they're going to starve to death. Page 214, first full paragraph. So, before the Vikings showed up, Ireland was it's basically the cultural leader of Europe. The educational center and the cultural leader of Europe. After the Vikings, they were no longer in that position. They were no longer leading the pack, leading the way there. The Vikings kind of crippled them. And then the English, when they came in, Queen Elizabeth, Cromwell, they just finished them off. The Vikings knocked them down, and the English came in and finished them off. They called it, they were trying to convert them. They said it was in the name of the Protestant faith. Really, it wasn't. it was a power play. It was a political power play. It was them trying to build their empire, and they found some convenient excuses to just to run roughshod over the Irish. Page 215, first full paragraph. But we cannot leave. So basically, I mean, the Irish just get trashed, and even into the 20th century, England has just got them under the thumb until they finally struggle out from underneath the thumb. So today, as a result of the Vikings coming in and wrecking everything, and then the English coming in and wrecking everything, nobody thinks of the Irish as being civilized or ever having been the cultural center of Europe, which is why Cahill is being kind of ironic when he titles his book How the Irish Saved Civilization. Because the first word that comes to most people's minds when they say civilized is not Irish. But it's more because it was sort of all taken away from them. But page 215, first full paragraph, but we cannot leave the Irish beaten into the clay. In all disasters, Patrick would insist there is ground for hope. Kilcash, which was a monastery, whose ruined tower still stands against the Tipperary sky, was a castle of the Anglo-Norman Butler family, whose descendant William Butler Yeats would one day bring such honor to Ireland as the greatest poet of the 20th century. We've talked about Yeats before. He kind of does for Ireland what Langston Hughes does for black people during the Harlem Renaissance. Kicks it off, right? Kicks off a revival in the Irish, again, seeing themselves as valuable. And suddenly you start to have great Irish literature and poetry created. And today you've got guys like Seamus Heaney, who actually died 10 years ago. But Yeats and a bunch of other guys come along in the 20th century who start to fight back against the English belittling the Irish and burying their identity, and give Irish people back a sense of, I'm Irish and I'm proud to be Irish, and this is my culture, and this is my art and my literature and my music. Page 216, the first, after the break, as we, the people of the first world, and he's talking about, Americans here, first world, 21st century people, the Romans of the 20th century look out across, so he's like, we are the Romans of the 20th century. Look out across our earth, we see some signs for hope, many more for despair. So there's, in a sense, you just look at America, especially white America, is kind of like the Romans, moving into the fall of the Roman Empire. Lazy, sitting around, not learning or not doing really useful jobs, not, just trying to maintain the status quo, with people on the outside trying to get in, who are desperate and not going to be kept out, because for them it's a matter of life, it's a matter of survival. And we've got, so Cahill is like, we face some very interesting similar circumstances to what the Roman Empire faced, but are we going to let, so as we're facing those challenges, are we going to let it do to us what it did to the Roman Empire, where it just destroys society and creates chaos for 100 years or so? Or will we wake up to things and deal with our different issues in a constructive way, and let what happened to Ireland happen to us? We learn from interaction with other cultures. We grow, we develop, we do great things, because we're able to open up and learn and grow and develop, like the Irish opened up and learned and grew and developed when Patrick showed up on their shores. And interestingly enough, Patrick was an immigrant, right? And he's the one who comes in and changes the whole country for the better, the whole culture, you know. Page 217, second full paragraph. What will be lost and what saved of our civilization, of this civilization, 21st century America, you know, for one thing, where we are right now, right? But even the world, you know, what will be lost and what's saved of our civilization probably lies beyond our powers to decide. No human group has ever figured out how to design its own future. In a sense, he's like, we can't just set our own roadmap for the future of 21st century civilizations around the world, right? Because, you know, history develops, and a lot of times you don't see it coming what does come. No civilization has ever created its own roadmap and followed its way, right? That's silly. But we can decide if we're going to be reactionary and be all defensive to change, or if we're going to try and learn from other cultures, other peoples, and change and grow in positive ways. Bottom of 217. Perhaps history is always divided in Romans and Catholics, or better, Catholics. The Romans are the rich and powerful who run things their way and must always accrue more because they instinctively believe that there will never be enough to go around. The Catholics, as their name implies, are universalists who instinctively believe that humanity is a family, that people are created by God and that God can provide. That we don't need to hoard up stuff for ourselves because might not be enough later. That we can share it. That God will provide. And you know, and again, I mean that sounds like it. Or you may not believe in God necessarily, but living with this mentality, if you don't believe in God, and that you don't have to go around hoarding up as much as you can of everything. You know, go hit the grocery marts and grab all the toilet paper you can. It's more an optimistic belief that if we share, there will be enough. The 21st century, prophesied Malraux, page 218, will be spiritual or it will not be. If our civilization is to be saved, forget about our civilization, which, as Patrick would say, may pass in a moment like a cloud or smoke that is scattered by the wind. If we are to be saved, it will not be by Romans, but by saints. And in a sense, you know, optimism, that's, you know, it's kind of a complicated thing because for, you know, most of the world is and always has been religious, you know, is and always has and always has believed in the supernatural and stuff, and there's hope there, you know. Without that belief, for example, for atheists and agnostics, there's just this knowledge that the universe is running down like clockwork, and so it is maybe a little more challenging to be hopeful if you don't believe in what most of humanity has believed in throughout history, which is the existence of the supernatural, you know, that there's more than meets the eye. But even if you don't, still, hopefully, you know, you've gleaned for your paper to use some ideas about, like, what do we learn from history that can help us with the issues that we're struggling with in our many different cultures and societies, actually, right? That all make up, even here in the U.S., you know, and in the other countries that some of you are from. Like, what do we learn from history, and how can we take that and address the issues of the day, of the current day. Yeah. Okay. Again, if you've got any questions about your paper as you're trying to work through it, get your ideas together, let me know. And this has been insightful, been interesting. Yeah, thanks for listening. Bye.